Alrighty, hello everybody. It's so great to be here talking to you today. My name is Nat Pendergraft. I am a student at Chapman University here in Southern California, and today I'm going to be talking to you about portrayals of fictional women in DC comic books. Now, I am by no means the definitive end-all be-all source of DC Comics. I do consider myself a fan, but this is a lot of character examples that I would like to present to you to give you a feel of what's happening in the comic book industry, especially recently. And this is going to be focused on DC Comics, so all my Marvel fans out there, I'm very sorry. I'm not as well versed in that subject, so I'm going to be using DC as sort of my example, if you will. So yeah, let's hop right into it. So the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is the character of Barbara Gordon. Now, specifically Barbara Gordon's role in the 1988 comic, The Killing Joke. So it was written by Alan Moore, and in this book, he wanted to shoot and paralyze Barbara Gordon, who was at the time Batgirl, and then have the Joker strip her down and take incriminating photographs of her in order to drive her father, Commissioner Gordon, crazy, as was the point of The Killing Joke. According to Alan Moore, our author, his editor, Len Wein, responded, "Yeah, okay, cripple the bitch," when Alan Moore asked, "Is it okay to paralyze this character?" So not great, but The Killing Joke was hailed as one of the best Batman stories ever told. It was very cutting edge, and of course it was Alan Moore, so it was incredibly well written. And it won an Eisner Award, it made the New York Times bestseller list, and it was adapted into an R-rated animated film, so if you're interested, you can check it out. Of course, there is very graphic imagery in it, but I think it is overall a well-told story. So let's get into what happened to Barbara Gordon after she was paralyzed by the Joker. So, following her paralyzation, she leaves behind Batgirl. She can no longer be the rooftop-hopping vigilante that she was before, and instead she assumes the identity of Oracle, who is a badass computer whiz who manages the Birds of Prey, which is an all-women superhero team that operates in Gotham City, from her wheelchair and a very high-tech computer setup. She trains the new Batgirl and mentors other girls who come after her, and she is disabled. She cannot walk. She is in a wheelchair, but it doesn't stop her from being any less of a superhero than anyone else. There are many occasions in which she proves that she is still the unstoppable force that she was before she was paralyzed. Times where she says directly to the Joker himself, like, "You took nothing from me. Do I look defeated to you?" She maintains her fighting prowess and all that. And she says on multiple occasions how she feels she has grown since being paralyzed. The loss of her ability to walk has not led to the loss of her quality of life. She has instead built this new life for herself, and I think this was the best outcome that really could have happened from Alan Moore's The Killing Joke. Unfortunately, nothing gold can stay, and most of this progress was retconned, which is a fancy comic book nerd term for the creators went back and got rid of it in the newer DC universes, and Barbara was de-aged, meaning her character was made younger in the timeline, and taken from her wheelchair without good reason. Occasionally, they completely ignore that this paralyzation ever happened, or sometimes there is some thing about like a spine implant, some bogus technology thing that allows her to walk. Either way, I feel it is incredibly tacky, and they could have just given us a disabled superhero, but I guess DC doesn't want to give that to me, so she's currently stuck in the role of quirky girl next door, solely existing for love interest purposes, specifically for Dick Grayson, and with none of the depth of her previous iteration. I personally am very bitter about this because I really enjoyed her as Oracle. I felt like Batgirl was a mantle that was meant to be passed on, especially to a younger generation. The newer heroes, like I said, Stephanie Brown and Cassandra Cain, but instead she's relegated back to being a permanent underling. She can never be the fully grown woman she was in the Oracle days. Okay, moving on. So our next character example is my personal favorite, and that's going to come across very quickly, is Starfire. Or Coriander is her like alien name, but translated to Starfire in English. So as I've put in the art on the side here, this is from Red Hood and the Outlaws, which is a 2011 comic. She is incredibly sexualized, and this is incredibly disappointing given the origins of this character. But in this comic specifically, she falls very much into the born sexy yesterday trope. There's an amazing YouTube video that explains it better than I could in the time I have to talk about the trope of born sexy yesterday, so I'll give you the gist. Basically, it is a female character that comes from a culture outside of Earth. So either an alien or a robot or a mermaid, whatever that may be. And that naivety, if you will, that lack of introduction to human culture makes her sexually available to any man who happens to desire her. So she has none of the modesty that your typical human woman would tend to have. If a man was sexually desiring her, she has no qualms about pleasuring them. And in Red Hood and the Outlaws specifically, she basically functions as a sex doll with superpowers, which is incredibly disappointing. They use her alienness to make her sexually available, to give her a culture that is incredibly cookie cutter in the sense that this is what a man would want, so this is how she acts. Her backstory is also rewritten, or she's perhaps given amnesia or loss of memory entirely, so she can be a blank slate for whatever the writers needed her to be. And of course, I don't really need to point this out, but there is incredibly unrealistic female anatomy. That's pretty clear from the art I have presented to you. There's a lack of accurate portrayal of the torso specifically, and incredibly sexualized posing. So this is just incredibly disappointing to me as someone who's a big fan of the character, and also seeing that writers, fans, as well as in-universe characters like Batman himself slut shame her, refer to her as that alien, or say that she's incapable of an emotional relationship, that she is instead delegated to purely sexual activities. And not to mention, her strength and abilities are often underplayed, with her background of being a highly trained warrior being ignored in favor of her more technical powers, like her being able to launch energy and fly. So instead of her being a tactical leader, warrior, princess, she is just strong and sexy, which is incredibly disappointing given everything that the character could be. And even when she's not highly sexualized, her character is still not done justice, unfortunately. This bottom picture here is from the kids show Teen Titans Go, which I incredibly dislike their portrayal of Starfire in that. And the top panel is from her solo comic, I believe 2008, the Starfire comic. And she's portrayed as very dumb, unfortunately. She's portrayed as someone who doesn't understand the mysterious human ways. She's portrayed as a stupid foreigner. And rather than using her as an avenue for writers to criticize gender norms or things that humans think innate to ourselves, they use her as prop comedy, like having her eat baking soda thinking that it's like a soda drink, which is boring to me, instead of having her question, why do men and women have to act in the way that they are expected to, or why does society expect this? And on top of that, she's often given non-white features and story elements. She was held in slavery for a time in her backstory, which is unfortunately an inherently non-white story element given the Earth's history of the West African slave trade. So this portrayal becomes racist and xenophobic as well. Xenophobic, of course, because she is a literal immigrant coming to this earth, but also racist because she's often given non-white features, whether that be a broader nose, darker skin, curly hair. That is typically features that are ascribed to women of color, specifically Black women. So her portrayal as being this bumbly, idiot, over-sexualized character is incredibly disappointing and frankly racist, in my opinion. And as I've said a million times, it's a huge disappointment for fans. She's highly emotionally intelligent, and she has a fantastic, very interesting backstory that could be used as a real avenue for people to criticize gender norms, criticize other avenues, other oppressions that we have on Earth. To have an alien character that doesn't question anything that humans do is incredibly disappointing, because in my opinion, non-human / non-Earth based characters should be used as a way to question, why does Earth do things like this? Why do Americans do things like this? Why do you say it this way? Why do you do it that way? Instead, she's just dumb and hot, and it's very disappointing. So I want to talk about a very common trope you'll see in virtually all comic books. I'm going to list some specific character examples, but unfortunately this applies to basically any comic book that features a woman. So it's writing women with the parameters that objectification is excused or even needed at some times. So, for example, a fictional woman is given a background or power or something else, some other factor of her character, so that sexualization is deemed a choice and in her favor. So an example of that would be a female character gets her power from having skin exposed. So she wears tight, revealing outfits. I'm sure you can think of some, but specifically in the DC universe, we have characters such as Power Girl and Supergirl, and Starfire, for that matter, who all get their power from the sun's radiation specifically. So the argument is that it benefits them to be wearing less things so that they can absorb more solar energy and thus have stronger abilities. However, there are male characters who also absorb the sun, but who do not get the same treatment. The example I would list for you here would be Superman, who gets his powers from the sun, solar radiation, just like Supergirl, and yet he gets to wear a full latex suit. For some reason, he is not put in a mini skirt and a crop top, and I wonder why. Next example I have is a female character who uses her sexuality or body to distract or manipulate a male adversary. So this is a character like Catwoman, someone who knows that they are appealing to men and uses that in her favor, whether it's to distract someone or to manipulate someone or whatever that may be. This female character purposefully is sexy to her benefit. And the next one, which kind of ties into this one, is a woman performing excessive femininity, so wearing a lot of makeup, wearing high heels, wearing other feminine items, skirts, dresses, etc., because she wants to. And my biggest qualm with that is you can't really argue that, oh, the character dresses sexy because she wants to, she likes it. Because more often than not, it's a male writer who's making that decision. This is a fictional character. She cannot decide for herself. So when you have male writers all conveniently choosing that their female characters like being sexy, it gets very suspicious. And they never portray the actual work that goes into perpetuating excessive femininity. Like they never portray female characters shaving their legs, plucking their eyebrows, applying makeup, removing makeup, doing skincare routines, whatever that may be. Often it's just they wake up looking beautiful and they go to sleep looking beautiful, and that's it. There is no effort put into it. And that just is unrealistic to me, which is annoying because of how interesting that could be from a writer's perspective, but also incredibly misogynistic at the end of the day. And now this last one is something I talked about with Starfire. It's a woman who's from a different world or culture, so she is free with her sexuality and body, specifically in a way that is pleasing to a male gaze. So instead of considering a woman from a vastly different culture than the ones we find here on Earth and having her maybe do typically masculine traits and thinking of it as feminine for her, or maybe doing something that's seen as unattractive, maybe preferring to have body hair or eating a lot of food, whatever that may be, typically unfeminine traits, why conveniently do all these alien cultures have very human standards of beauty? It's very odd that even when they want to portray someone from a vastly different culture than the ones we find on Earth, they still happen to fall into the category of conventionally attractive. And this is, of course, again, as I said, because most of the time there are male writers or male artists. And even if the writer or the artist is a woman, typically you have male executives that are making decisions, telling their writers and artists like, oh, you should portray her like X. You should do X, Y, and Z. She shouldn't be wearing that much, or she should be posing sexy, or you need to draw her in this way, whatever that may be. A lot of the times, unfortunately, it's male executives that hold positions of power that they can then tell the creatives what they want them to do. So this is a big one for me. I'd like to talk about it. It's a bad female anatomy in comic books. So as you can see with the examples that I've presented here, it is extremely common for female characters to be drawn in a terribly inaccurate anatomical way. It is incredibly disappointing as a reader to see these things, and sometimes it's funny to me how ridiculously crooked someone's spine is, or how unrealistic a pose is, or how small their waist is. But most of all, it really points to the idea that female characters in comic books have to be sexy or attractive to be worthwhile, to get stories, to get backstory. They have to be attractive, and they have to purposefully display this attractiveness even when they are fighting someone, when they are defending themselves or in a very serious situation. They still find a way to rip their top in the perfect way that shows off their cleavage, or bend their spine super unnaturally to show off their butt. And it's incredibly disappointing. And as someone who loves to read comic books, this really pulls me out of the experience. It ruins my suspension of disbelief because it's a jarring reminder of how these writers and artists and executives, as I said, view their female characters. It's very hard to take a woman's character seriously in terms of her backstory and her development, her opinions, her feelings, when she's drawn like this. And that's incredibly disappointing. And it leads to oftentimes a larger male audience in comic books, because this is all pandering to the male gaze. And it's incredibly disappointing to female readers who will be invested in a story and reading about their favorite character and then see them drawn like this. And something else I'd like to point out specifically, not only is it incredibly inaccurate to not be giving these women the proper rib cages or waists or the organs that they need to live, but also many of these characters on the screen right now are trained warriors, professionals, really good at fighting in some capacity, and yet they are drawn very skinny. For some reason, a lot of comic books feel no need to give female characters muscles, even if, in real life, to pull off the things that they are doing in these comics, you would need a muscular frame or have some sort of built body type in order to do all these flips or do all that punching or do all that whatever it is that they're doing in the comics. So it's distressing to see a woman who's portrayed as strong in the writing, but not physically shown as strong. And it, again, panders to that male gaze issue. There is a problem with conventional attractiveness in women that visible muscles or like bulging biceps are seen as unattractive, that's unwomanlike, which I think is very stupid, especially if these are, as I said, trained warrior fighters who are fighting crime or doing evil things or flying into space. They should at least have something on them, right? Even if they have superpowers, that's no excuse because they're still using their muscles. And now I want to talk about comparison to male anatomy specifically. I've heard the argument posed many times that, well, even though female characters are drawn sexy, you could argue in the same sense that male characters are drawn sexy. And this is true. There is a sexualizing aspect to the anatomy of male characters. However, overwhelmingly, it is not intended for a female audience. It is not meant to pander to the quote-unquote female gaze. It is meant to be a power fantasy for the male readers, to imagine yourself as this buff macho man who can save the day and get the girl. And showing these direct comparisons, now arguably these are beginner's manuals. So these are pages from books I have found that are like how to draw comics, ideally for beginners. However, I think this is really indicative of how the majority of characters are drawn in a lot of comic books. This is the rule, and anything you see outside of that is the exception. Oftentimes you will see men with broad shoulders and slimmer waists, but still bulging muscles, and women with basically no visible muscles at all, even if they are the same caliber or even better fighters than their male counterparts. And also, the idea that a hypothetical woman couldn't look like one of these male drawings or a hypothetical man couldn't look like one of these female drawings is ridiculous to me, because bodies come in all shapes and sizes. People look different than this cookie cutter image that we get so often. And this is a disservice to female fans as well as male fans. The fact that there are virtually no plus-sized superheroes is incredibly disappointing. And even if there is a plus-sized superhero in some comics, often another artist will draw them much skinnier, which is very indicative of the fat phobia that we have in the comic book industry as well. So the image in the middle particularly is telling you how to draw certain tropes. And it's extremely distressing to me that the quote-unquote fat guy is, if you can read the text there, it says, is often portrayed as jolly. So meaning like a Santa Claus archetype, which, okay, sure, but can also play a villain, working on the gluttonous angle, which, interesting to me that you didn't say could be a villain or a hero, just a villain. So plus-size male characters are allowed to be evil, but somehow not allowed to be the heroes, the protagonists that save the day. Now, I think it is ridiculous to say that these are the only body types that you find, even in superheroes. If you look at people who do great athletic feats, such as the only people I can think of are Olympians in our world, you will see a wide range of body types, heights, figures, builds, etc., based on what it is that they do, what it is that they specialize in. The body type of a gymnast is going to be different than the body type of a swimmer, and that's going to be different from the body type of a weightlifter. People who do different things, who specialize in different tasks, have different body types because of that. And of course, genetics is a huge role here. So the idea that everyone can somehow attain this look just by working really hard and believing in yourself is bogus at the end of the day. Now, there is just so much work to be done. A great plethora of the writers and artists that I have found that have had sexual assault allegations made against them, or have written chronically misogynistic portrayals of their female characters, often maintain their careers, even get promoted into the higher executive ranks. And it's incredibly distressing to see that even in the era of Me Too, that people aren't getting the consequences that they deserve. Writers such as Alan Moore, which I mentioned with The Killing Joke, some have come forward and said, I didn't mean, or I shouldn't have portrayed a female character that way, and I apologize. And I feel like that's the right way to go about it. Just understanding that what they may have done in the past wasn't okay at the end of the day, and their portrayal was misogynistic or sexist. And since this is a male-dominated field, especially with most leadership positions controlled by men, we often find that comics pander to the male gaze. And this is something that I think the comic book industry has to actively fight against. Just hiring more female writers or female artists doesn't really fix much unless you get women in the higher echelons of the executive, I almost said the executive branch, the executive levels of the comic book industries. The executive branch too, but that's unrelated to this. Now, another thing that I think needs to be actively fought against is over-sexualized female anatomy. Now, I'm not talking necessarily about poor anatomy, though that is a problem in its own respect, but over-sexualized anatomy. So it's not that the arms are drawn too short or too long, or the head is too big, or maybe the shoulders are a little wonky. It's specifically women that are drawn in a way that makes them conventionally attractive, that makes them sexually appealing. That I think is one of the biggest troubles in terms of comic book art, the physical drawing art of comic books. But we also have the characterization, the portrayal of women who are accessible sexually, who will pander to any man who gives them attention, maybe men who treat them poorly or are below them in their caliber of work. This is incredibly disappointing, especially if previous characterizations disputed that, to be writing female characters who have their own backstory, who have their own agency, as people who live and revolve around the men in their life. I find it ridiculous, unrealistic, and extremely annoying. Now, in the comic books where you do get well-written female characters, and there are many, don't let me lead you wrong here. There are so many comic books with amazing female characters. However, the majority of those amazingly written female characters are usually heterosexual or white or able-bodied, and so on and so forth, any other privileged status. There is a huge lack of well-written non-white female characters. I can't think of many that would hit the same status as the white characters that DC Comics specifically, but also Marvel has. And there's often whitewashing. So a character that may have gotten an ethnic background in the past suddenly is portrayed as extremely white and without with white features and with a white backstory, and makes you wonder, why did they change their tune on that one? Women of color usually get single issues or cameos, meaning they appear in someone else's comic book, or they get a couple comics but not a full series. And then there's rarely any follow-up with them. Women of color are, unfortunately, either members of a larger group or sidekicks to white men. And that's extremely indicative of, I think, what the comic book industry sees women of color as, specifically Black women, of course, getting the shortest stick in the bunch. And to top it all off, there's a huge lack of LGBT representation that is not hypersexualized or for the male gaze. You may know some prominent queer characters in comic books to be primarily women. So this is characters such as Kate Kane or Batwoman, characters such as Harley Quinn or Poison Ivy, who are portrayed as queer female characters. And I think this is awesome. However, oftentimes this is very much highly sexualized for the male gaze. Instead of focusing on what a relationship between two women is like, it's focusing on what a man looking at a relationship between two women is like. And on top of that, there is a huge lack of gay men representation in comics. Because, as I've said before, it's a power fantasy. And heterosexual male audiences don't want to see their favorite male character be turned into a homosexual because they think it's emasculating and they think they can't be a hero and they think they have specific set ideas of what queer men are like in their head, and that does not fit into the cookie cutter representation of superheroes that they actively crave. So unfortunately, there's a huge lack of LGBT representation, and touching on the T, huge lack of trans people in comic books. I really can't think of many main characters that have gotten their own comics that are trans. Most of the time they are side characters, supporting characters, whatever that may be. And of course, people of color, trans people of color even more so. Always getting the worst situation. But still, in my opinion, comics are worth a female audience. I think there are so many amazing stories that are there to be told through comic books. I think that there is a lot of social commentary, as well as a lot of very interesting relationships and situations that can be represented in comic books. And the only way we're going to fix these problems is if women actively demand better from the comic book industry. If DC Comics, and Marvel Comics as well, but again, I focus on DC, is allowed to continue with their portrayal of women in this way, then they're not going to stop. If no one challenges them or criticizes them, then there's no reason for them to stop what is a very profitable industry. If there are going to be adjustments made to the way that women are portrayed in comic books, there has to be an active female readership. Now, comics come in all varieties. They come in all genres. They come in all art styles and all types. I'm positive that you can find a comic book out there that is for you. Whether it be Watchmen by Alan Moore, which is very good, or a Justice League comic book, or a Spider-Man comic book, whatever that may be, there are so many comic books out there that I can pretty much guarantee that there's one out there that you would like. And being able to recognize these problems is the first step in being able to fix them. So recognizing when a female character is being portrayed as born sexy yesterday, or being portrayed in a hypersexualized way, or being portrayed without agency, without a good backstory, or perhaps whitewashed, or perhaps without given her typical ethnic background. You have to be, unfortunately, you have to be educated in the comics themselves to recognize that. And once you are able to recognize that, you can call the comic book industry out on it. And that's going to be our avenue to fixing these problems. I think it's great that more female comic book writers and artists are being hired, even though the majority of those are white women. There's still a lot of progress to be done, however, because just having a female artist doesn't mean that your comic book will be devoid of all sexism or misogyny in the art or the writing or whatever it may be. Having more women in the industry at large is what's going to help fix this issue. And not only that, but a more diverse range of women, disabled women, queer women, women of color, etc., etc. Just hiring one white woman and calling it a day is not going to cut it, unfortunately. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much